Things Hidden. Well, welcome back to Things Hidden, our podcast where we dive into the rest of the story, as Paul Harvey used to say, the story behind why we do the things we do as human beings in our relationships and our personal and private relationships, as well as our social community building. Why do we have the same old politics? Why do we have the same blame games? Why do we have the same tit-for-tat wars, tit-for-tat sanctions, tit-for-tat scandals and political intrigue? And it seems like it never ends. Well, in order to understand how to end it, we have to understand the deeper human anthropological mechanisms behind these patterns of behavior. And on this program, we are guided by imitating and learning from the life of Jesus. And this is something that's in a secular context that we talk about this, meaning we're not getting into theology, we're not getting into spiritual claims on this podcast for this topic. We're talking about the social implications of imitating Jesus. And so whatever your views are, whatever your religious views or secular, agnostic, whatever you have, you're going to glean something from this, because at the very least, we can agree that Jesus is the most important man in history. He's had the biggest impact by far from any prince or king or philosopher or scientist or politician that we've heard of. And we count our time by his name. And so he's someone that you want to really take serious and understand why did he have such an outsized impact in what he did, especially when you really look at the things he says and how subversive they are to powerful structures, how they kind of undermine the logic of violence, the logic of bullying, and the logic of might makes right. And so previously I talked about the kind of riddle, the puzzle behind the idea of Jesus' statement about how can Satan cast out Satan. And so we were building up this explanation for this, and it's key to note that when we talk about Satan in the context of anthropology and social context, we're not implying the spiritual aspect. That's a question for another time, another discussion. We're talking about the human part of that word, Satan, which means accuser. It's the literal word for what's going on there in the passage. How can the accuser cast out the accuser? And so in this context, we're talking about how governments and societies function in the ancient world on this process of scandal and jealousy and resentment and envy, but then having to bottle that up by blaming a common enemy to justify, the guilt, the blame that we feel, to blame a common enemy to atone, to cleanse ourselves of the bad blood that we build up in our tribes. And we do it today in companies and families and businesses and governments and global organizations. It's something that happens on a daily basis. And the gospel stories help us understand that, help us demystify the hidden blind spots for human behavior in a very practical and down-to-earth way. And so I said I was going to talk about the hour of Satan that Jesus alludes to, which is where he is betrayed by his disciples and ultimately abandoned and then persecuted because of what he had said. He's persecuted by not only the political figures, but also the religious figures in power of his time. He's persecuted not just by the authorities of his own religion at the time, but also the Roman occupiers of that land. They have a total unification around the exclusion and killing of Jesus. And in the telling of that story, and this is something you got to remember, that media serves as a technology. It actually adds value. It actually allows us to do things differently when we have a media like the gospel text, because it allows us to see things hidden that we couldn't see otherwise, right? So if you can report a story that disproves a politician's case for war, if you can show a video that disproves an event that the politicians say Gulf of Tonkin, they use that to justify going to Vietnam. If you can find counterfactual evidence that the Gulf of Tonkin event was fabricated or was a staged event used to precipitate the Vietnam War, well, then guess what? You can act on that. That's media serving as a technology. So remember that the gospel texts, the stories of Jesus' life, they function on a technological level. They allow us to see things and then not do dumb things like war and fighting and using the state to bludgeon our neighbors for nonviolent and victimless behaviors. Even if they're awful stuff, we have to learn to grow up from that kind of barbarity, and the Gospels are trying to help us wean us off of that and help us deconstruct why we do what we do. And so when Jesus is persecuted, you got to remember a few stories that lead up to this, and there's a lot of stories, but I'll just pick a few to highlight kind of the mechanism of collective violence that he's unmasking by going through this ritual of allowing his community to treat him as a scapegoat. First, think of the word pharmakos. The Greeks, ancient Greeks, had a ritual, a pharmakos ritual. That's where we get the word pharmaceutical. Pharmakos, it means drug, it means cure. It's the antidote, right? The antidote for the community's ills was the common parading and persecution of a misfit, sometimes a freak, sometimes someone disabled, sometimes someone who is, an outcast. And they would parade this person, hunchback or disabled, awful, stuff they would do to them, and they would cast them out of the community as a way of kind of remembering how their society functions. It functions on the mutual exclusion of misfits. And misfits can come in different shapes and sizes, but they need to be believable bad guys. They need to be believable, people to scandalize and destroy, to feel like you've cast your sins you've cast your guilt onto someone that's uglier or worse than you or scarier than you. All kinds of little arbitrary, things can be used to justify the pharmakos ritual of the Greeks and many other communities in that time. And so Jesus actually performs. He allows the persecutors of his own community and Rome to come together and perform a pharmakos ritual, a scapegoat king ritual. It's very similar to the Saturnalia festival. And again, this is a Roman festival around winter solstice to celebrate the scapegoat mechanism, to celebrate how communities let loose a little bit and have a crisis of undifferentiation where everybody loses their sense of self. Masters switch places with their slaves for a day and let the slaves be served by the masters. Everybody wears masks so you can't see who you're dancing with in the campfire dances. So you don't know if you're dancing with the mayor's wife or the plumber's wife or anybody. You're just all in a masked state of undifferentiation. There's orgies, there's feasts. You don't know if, one person brought celery, the other person brought prime rib. Everybody pitched in. That's a state of undifferentiation. You don't know who really contributed, if they contributed fairly or equally or proportionally. And so that undifferentiated, controlled chaos is the festival of Saturnalia, and it would climax with selecting a candidate for sacrifice, a slave oftentimes who would be put up in royal attire, royal treatment, given the finest wine, the finest orgies, and everything, the most decadent, taboo-breaking behaviors that he or she, or probably I think it's usually a he, would engage in, and then they would put even a crown sometimes, and then sacrifice. There's evidence that they sacrificed, at least in the earliest stages of this ritual, earliest evidence of this ritual, they would sacrifice the person for the god of Saturn. And so, you got to remember, this is the backdrop by which we have this gritty, realistic eyewitness account from Jesus' followers who are showing that Jesus is being treated in the same fashion as the Leviticus scapegoat ritual back in the old times of Leviticus, where the scapegoat was cast out of the community for the sins of the community. And then he's also patterning the same practice of Saturnalia, the Greek pharmakos ritual, and thousands of other communities around the world were doing this thing for thousands of years to justify the logic of the state, or the logic of might makes right, of sacrificial violence, the idea that it's better that one man die than the whole nation perish. That's what Caiaphas said as his campaign to execute Jesus was kicked into high gear in the text. So So think about a few stories here to highlight what's going on with Jesus' persecution and crucifixion. And there's so much to unpack, but we'll just try to give a few nuggets to chew on. So think about the story where Satan takes Jesus to a high place. There's actually a traditional location, we call that Temptation Mountain, Mount of Temptation, in the wilderness, where Jesus is taken up to a high place in the mountain, and basically the accuser, right? The accuser in that context, he tells Jesus, look, if you just bow down and be like me, if you just worship me, if you just imitate me, then you'll have the kingdoms of the world. Now, I've been to that location. Beautiful, interesting place. And it's, you know what it overlooks? Well, I was in the city of Jericho, the ancient city of Jericho. And Jericho translates into Moon City. They worship the moon god. That's their traditional heritage. And I remember, being in the center of Jericho, the city center, looking at the ruins of a sacrificial temple that had been, thousands and thousands of years ago, had been used to sacrifice humans, alive, and animals to the moon god. Which was the patron saint of that, that was the patron god of that community. And so it was interesting because someone pointed out, and up over in the distance right there is the traditionally known spot for where people believe Jesus was tempted in the wilderness, in that mountain. Now, it could have been the mountain next to it. Doesn't really matter. The point is, somewhere in that vicinity, people have had a tradition to say this is probably where Jesus was in the wilderness. And it's interesting because if that's the case, and there's a nice monastery, this old monastery is beautiful at the top of the cliff there. It's just kind of like on the side. It's very, very dramatic. But it's interesting because you can look at that location, and you can imagine if Jesus was looking out on that mountain with the accuser saying, just be like me and you'll have the kingdoms of the world in your hand. You got to remember, Jesus had a growing movement, thousands of people, misfits, outcasts, poor, rich, people, tax revolters, tax collectors. Everybody was coming together in this powerful movement of Jesus's message of forgiveness and love and the nonviolence and the redemption of the people. And so you can imagine this is a psychological drama in which Jesus is feeling the temptation of taking this movement and rolling it up into the standard procedure we see throughout history. And again, just to make this sink in, think of like a William Wallace, right? Your people are being persecuted. You rise up with a violent revolt against your occupiers, and you throw them off in a violent contest. And you can imagine that's the way the world has functioned. That's the way governments and revolutions function. It's someone sacrificing people, and then maybe there's a rise up or a revolt and a revolution, and it replaces something oftentimes even more tyrannical than the first oppressor. And that pattern happens over and over again. That's the accuser, right? That's violence casting out violence. And so when this accuser character is looking at Jesus saying, just imitate me, worship me. Think about the word worship. It means imitate, adore me, be like me. Then you'll have the kingdoms of the world. Imagine that's what Jesus is thinking in his head. Maybe he's tempted by this idea that, hey, I could really be a political figure. I could be the kind of king that a lot of people in my crowds probably think I'm going to be, which is a king that uses political coercion, and that could mean political power, political intrigue, or even a downright populist revolt of the people to overthrow the wicked oppressors who are doing awful things to our community. But instead, he says, get behind me, accuser, right? So remember, he rejects that temptation. And then you have Peter again, and then let's go to Peter, where Peter is, Jesus is saying, I've got to, lay down my life and soon. And then Peter says, let it not be said that you would do that, Lord. We're not going to let that happen. And, he's talking like a tough guy, but in some sense, you can hear the real story behind Peter's words, which is, hey, Jesus, I thought this was going to be a political revolution. I thought we were going to take the castle. It's time to overthrow the 1% that's oppressing the 99, right? And Jesus says, no, get behind me, accuser. He calls him Satan, right? But that word is accuser. He said, get behind me, accuser. You don't know the things of God if that's what you think. You're trying to make me stumble. He says, you're a stumbling block. So Peter was trying to draw Jesus into the temptation of not going through the way of peace, which Jesus was going to demonstrate when he was going to go through the persecution and crucifixion that was coming to him, right? He knew he had to do this in order to reveal the truth to mankind. And so he says, don't tempt me into not doing this. He's saying, don't tempt me into doing this the way God wants me to do it. You're trying to tempt me into doing this the way of man, where, let's just get a political revolt and I'll be installed as the king and you'll be my right hand and whoever else, and we'll run the show and we'll do a better job than the wicked guys, running the show now. Isn't that the nature that we think of every time we think of elections? Get rid of those scoundrels and we'll clean it. And we fall for this lie every time. And that's the old mythic lie that the Christian story is drawing humanity out of to mature us. The old mythic lie of might makes right is the way of being a child. It's an infant stage of humanity, and the adult stage of humanity is the way of peace, the way of nonviolence, which doesn't mean there's no room. There is a room for self-defense, and there's a room for law that restrains murder and rape and assault and harming children and fraud and theft, things that actually have a real victim that you can put on the report. Things that involve violence and coercion and aggression. But overall, in a Jesus imitating vision of society, nonviolence would be the glue that binds us together rather than sacrifice, rather than Satan casting out Satan, rather than violent revolutions and overthrows and elections where we're going to get the rich, or then the other guys come in and say, we're going to get the immigrants or the globalists. There's always this tit for tat thing. That's the way of religion. That's the way that humans have bound themselves together for tens of thousands of years, and that's the way that Jesus is drawing us out of in these stories. And so that's what we see in the persecution of Jesus. We see that Luke, in the book of Luke, he says that Herod, and who's the king of the Jews, he was a politician that's running the Jewish people, and then you have Pontius Pilate. And he's the governor installed by Rome to oversee this troublesome, it's a troublesome spot for the Roman Empire. And, they've had some quarrels, but apparently it says in Luke that they were able to resolve they became friends. They were united through their trial of Jesus, through that kind of process of going through the madness of trying to execute Jesus. But in the story of Jesus, we see that even his own followers who had known him and been with him for 3 years, at least, they abandoned him in different ways. They ran. They didn't speak up. They didn't stand and fight. When Peter, the guy who was supposed to be the toughest guy of them all, when a young woman says, you sound like a Galilean, you sound like one of those rednecks that knows Jesus. You know anything about this guy? And he said, I don't know him, right? And the Gospels are powerful there because it takes note of Peter's sorrow when that happens, because he realizes, because the gospel is radical for its time, it's concerned with the emotions and the pain and suffering of a poor, illiterate, perhaps fisherman like Peter. Whereas in the ancient world, texts that were writing mythology, texts that were writing politics, basically the same thing, they would not concern themselves with the sorrow and the plight of a common fisherman like Peter. But in the Gospels, we see this radical maturation that's going to wean us off of sacrificial violence in history. It's a slow process. The church has messed it up many times, but they're not unique in that. They're just humans just like all of us, and it's a process of uncovering things hidden since the foundation of the world. And so in this story of Jesus' persecution, we see the sausage making of myth and violence revealed. We see how we say the gods demand sacrifice, but in reality, it's just crowds. There's no, look at the stories of the Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Do you see it saying, the gods have demanded that Jesus die? No, what you see is it's a crowd. One week they were cheering for him as he came into Jerusalem, and then the next week they're saying crucify him. But it's a crowd that's whipped up into violent desire to see a misfit like Jesus eliminated and blamed and accused and then murdered. And it's contrasted there with Barabbas, right? Bar Abbas means of the Father. And in the earliest texts, like I believe in Mark and others, you see the original text of the Gospels show that his name was Jesus Barabbas. So you have in the story where Pontius Pilate presents Jesus, Yeshua, the one we know in history, and then there's this other Jesus, it's a common name in that area, Jesus Barabbas, who is this revolutionary who is arrested for trying to overthrow the Roman occupation. And so the crowd is given a choice. Do you want the non-violent Jesus who is non-aggression and non-vengeance and who knows the ways of peace? Or do you want the one who will be your revolutionary? He'll be your overthrow of the establishment, and he'll take about, who do you want to release? And the crowd says, release our typical politician, our typical revolter, right? Our typical tough guy who wants to overthrow things through coercion, through the accuser casting out the accuser. And so they say, crucify Jesus, let the Jesus Barabbas go. And that's what happens. So in some sense, Jesus fulfills the scapegoat role that's in Leviticus, the goat that's cast out, but he also, Barabbas actually fulfills that in some sense in that story because he's let go and Jesus is killed. And Jesus fulfills the other goat's role because in the Leviticus, there's two goats. There's a goat that is brought into the high priest and he kills him and uses his blood to show that there's atonement in the high priest, Holy of Holies. And he takes the blood and he acts as if that's his blood. And then there's the other goat, the scapegoat, that's cast off in the wilderness to die. But Jesus fulfills both of those goat metaphors in this intentional enactment of the sausage making of sacrificial violence. So when go back just for a moment as we close here, go back to when Jesus is riding into Jerusalem and he has that climactic scene where he's going to have his showdown with the forces of violence, the forces of collectivism, the forces of mythic sacred violence. He says, "O Jerusalem, if you had only known the ways of peace, but now they're hidden from your eyes." And what were the ways of peace? I always like to let you think about that. Was he just being facetious? Or did he actually mean there was a specific thing, there was a specific course of action, transformation of the heart and choices that his people could have made to avert the Roman destruction that came upon them in 70 AD? I think he was pointing to something that we'll look into in the next time. What are the ways of peace that Jesus was alluding to? And for now, I'll leave you with that. I'm David Gornoski. You can email me, david@aneighborschoice.com. You're listening to Things Hidden. More will be uncovered soon.